CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
Okay, and we're live.
All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Those of you who are on YouTube or Facebook, thanks for tuning in to today's Cello Chat. And thank you to Cello Bello for inviting me to be a speaker. I prepared just a very brief sort of presentation, more just discussion about one of my favorite topics pertaining to cello playing, which is effective fingerings and their importance, how to find them, and what to think about when you're looking for new fingerings. So I'll talk about that for about 15, 20 minutes, depending on how things go, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So don't go anywhere, and I look forward to seeing all of your questions. All right, so just to kind of kick things off, I'll just talk a little bit about why I chose this topic. For as long as I can remember, I've been really passionate about the history of recorded cello playing. And one of my favorite things to do, it still is one of my favorite things to do, is to go on YouTube and watch great cellists, their renditions of different pieces, and analyze what exactly they're doing technically. So what bowings, what fingerings, and also things like what sorts of motions they do at particular moments, or when they look at the conductor, if they're playing a concerto, stuff like that. So I'm a bit of a nerd in that respect. I love doing that, and I noticed over time that a lot of great cellists have very different approaches to what fingerings work for them, and this got me thinking a lot in my own practice about how I can find the best fingerings for my own playing and my own performances of these same pieces that I was watching them play. Because sometimes I'd try a fingering that like, for example, Rostropovich was using, and it just wouldn't work for me. Or, in pretty extreme case, someone like Daniel Shafran, probably 75% of his fingerings wouldn't work for me. So it's a very interesting topic. And to kind of conclude the prelude, say, I often see in other cellists and sometimes students, when I hear people in master classes, I often see that they are playing with suboptimal fingerings. And it's not the fact that they're playing with suboptimal fingerings that's troubling. It's more the fact that they're not aware that there are better options available to them, and they're not aware of how to search for those better options. So that's what I kind of wanted to just talk a little bit about today. So let's just talk about, so I have some notes here that I'm going to refer to so I don't lose my train of thought. So the first thing that I want to say is that fingerings belong to a set of decisions that we make on our cello that have a great influence on the way that we sound. And that seems like a pretty self-evident statement, but actually it's if you think about it, for example, shifting, right? Shifting is one of the most important things about any fingering choice. Shifting literally changes the way that a passage can sound, right? Because the shift is heard, or if it's attempted to be concealed, then that attempt is likely going to disrupt something else, like the legato or the fluidity of the phrase. So the choice of fingering can really have a very strong effect on the ultimate output. And one of my favorite things to do is listen to audio recordings only of cellists and try to guess what fingerings they're using. And I think after a while you can become pretty good at this, especially if you are familiar with like the different timbral qualities of like the D string versus the A string, for example. So that's to say that fingering is really an important part of a musical decision that we make. And for me, the most important thing is when we're evaluating what fingering to choose, to think about the music that's in front of us as belonging to a continuum. And that continuum, in my opinion, is a pretty simple one. Basically, at the bottom end, you have music that is not technical at all. So like, for example, let's just say you're holding a note like a G and you're just playing, you know, and that's part of the accompaniment of whatever else is going on, or, you know, whatever, or you're playing just a few notes. That would be very non-technical music because there's not a lot happening in terms of different notes, in terms of the necessity of shifts, in terms of different strings. And, you know, that's obviously a very, very rudimentary example. But as I said, it's a continuum. So you want to start from the simplest thing, and then, of course, you move all the way up, which brings me to the other side of the spectrum, which is music that is intensely technical. So like a good example of that would be any sort of scalar passage. Like, for example, I'm working on the Elgar Cello Concerto right now, and this big scale, et cetera, et cetera. I would consider that quite high up on the continuum of technicality because, and I think this is a really important point, because the essence of the passage is its accuracy, is the accuracy of its execution. So to give you a couple other examples, like something like the Pauper Elfentanz, you know, you have all this stuff, you know, you need positions, you need fingerings that keep you in the same position so that you can do a lot of finger work within the position, and you know, you're going to be moving a lot between your fingers and shifting on occasion from one position to another so you can do new stuff. So that would be, you know, yet another example of highly technical music. So this continuum exists, right? And I just gave you examples of the extremities of the continuum. But most music is somewhere in the middle, right? And I think being aware of this continuum, understanding what it is that makes the bottom of the continuum the way it is and the top of the continuum the way it is, can help us a lot to understand what to do with all the stuff in the middle. So I'm going to branch out just a bit now and talk first a little bit about highly technical passages for fingering, because I think that that's a point of interest for a lot of people. And I often hear people say like, oh, you know, I'm struggling with this passage, it's just too hard, it's too fast, etc. And they might even have a good fingering, but it's just very difficult. So let's talk about that first. So in technical passages, for me, the most important thing is that you want to avoid unnecessary motion. And basically what that means is that you want to limit the amount of shifts and you want to maximize the amount of in-position playing. So to give you a really crude example, in the Elfentanz that I just, you know, gave you, this passage, if you were playing at a full tempo, whatever, or you could play also here, which would also be in one position, right? But if you suddenly decided, oh, I'm going to try, you know, it just wouldn't work at all, right? Because you're shifting like so frequently relative to the tempo that it's just practically impossible to execute at speed, right? Which is why we need to look for in-position solutions to executing those particular notes, right? So that's sort of the big thing, right? And that's a very crude example, but there are many passages where it's possible to do something both with shifts and without, right? It might be a more reasonable tempo than the tempo of the Elfentanz. And you have to make a decision about whether you need the shift or not. And often this decision comes with a compromise. For example, if you don't shift, you might lose a little bit of projection because you're playing on the D string, for example, for part of it. And the sound of the D string, you know, is not as as bright, as projecting as the A. But on the other side, if you were to do that fingering that involved playing less in position, then you would be shifting more. And I think the most important thing about shifting when it comes to technical passages is that a shift always introduces an element of risk. Often, especially when we're shifting a lot, shifting can become a little bit like throwing darts, and where you feel like you're kind of just you're kind of shooting for the note, and you're not sure if you're going to get it, or you might have like a 70-80% accuracy rate with that particular shift, and that's not a good feeling to have. I think we've all sort of been in that position where a particular shift is causing us discomfort or trouble. And in highly technical passages, as I said before, the most important objective, the point of the music, is the execution, is the accurate execution of the music, right? So Elfentanz is nothing if you can't play the notes, right? The wonder of the piece is the rapid fire execution of all these notes and the way that it wows the audience. That's pretty much the point. I mean, of course, there are other aspects like the dynamics and the articulation, but fundamentally, if you can't nail all the pitches at the right precise moments in the left hand, then it's going to be sloppy and therefore ineffective as a piece of music. So those are just a few thoughts on the very extreme end of technical work, the very technical passage work that we encounter. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about the other end, very, shall I say, non-technical. And another way that you can think about this, which is pretty common, although not always the case, is more lyrical music, right? Music where the priority is not so much the accurate execution, but the nature of the execution, right? Because maybe the passage is just not as hard to play in absolute terms. Like it's not as hard to play all the notes in tune because it's a slower tempo, or there are fewer notes, or it's kind of naturally fewer positions with fewer shifts, right? In that kind of music, the priority really becomes what one will do with personal expression, because like to take a very simple example, let's say you just have three notes like F sharp D, F sharp E D, like, and you're just playing, and it's something at that tempo roughly. Let's just say. Obviously, you can do all those notes in position, and if you did, probably no one would fault you. But of course, it depends on the exact situation, because let's say something else is going on. Let's say it's a piece of chamber music, and there's a really nice harmony on the E, for example. Well, in that case, you might decide that you actually want to shift. You want to shift because the shift creates an element of expression that playing in position doesn't, right? So you might decide you want to do something like that, right? Now that would be, in terms of like what we were just talking about with the technical passages, that would be kind of a broken rule, right? Because you don't want to shift unless you have to shift in general when you're approaching technical passages. But this isn't a technical passage, so you could do whatever you want. In fact, you could do all of them on the same finger to do, two shifts, two slides. If you really thought that would be the best way to proceed musically. So that's just a very simple example. And I think the most important thing, we're going to dive into a more complex example in a second, but the most important thing pertaining to expressive fingerings when it comes to less technical passage work is that you want to remember that the fingers have a hierarchy. Not all of our fingers are created equally, especially in terms of vibrato, because vibrato is the one place where the strength of the finger really comes through, the strength or the lack thereof. And in general, I like to think of it with this ranking, sort of. You have the second finger would definitely be the gold medal, and I want to thank Amit Peled, who's a wonderful teacher, colleague. He was the first person to introduce me to this concept of ranking the fingers. I think it's a very interesting idea. So the middle finger would get the gold medal. It's the best because it's in the middle of the hand, and when you vibrate, you can have very balanced natural vibrato with a lot of ease. Then maybe this is where it kind of becomes more up to one's opinion, but third and first finger, maybe you'd give third the silver medal and then first the bronze, or you could tie them both for silver, depending on the particular qualities of your hand. And then fourth really doesn't place because it's not a great finger, right? And the vibrato typically is weaker. It's a shorter finger, and it's at the extremity of the left hand, so it's harder to find the rich balance that you can find in the other fingers. Interestingly enough, a quick tangent. I remember when I was proposing this to one of my former teachers, Emanuel Feldman, from whom I learned so much. He said something very interesting which stuck with me. I told him, well, I think the fourth finger, it doesn't place, it's not a good finger. It gets fourth prize, no medal. And he was like, well, I think the fourth finger needs to have a medal. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, well, if it's fourth place, you need to train it up so it's like third place, worthy of third place, right? So really practice having a good fourth finger vibrato so that it places. If first and third would tie for silver, then fourth would definitely get bronze, right? So that's, of course, something we can aim toward, but at the same time, it's good to be aware sort of the limitations of our own hand. So I want to give you a little more complex example of this kind of lyrical passage work. So let's take the famous second theme from the first movement of the Dvorak Concerto, and this is a huge, there's kind of a huge theoretical discussion going on between cellists silently whenever I see them play it, because I see people do all sorts of different fingerings and bowings for that matter in this passage, and everyone makes their case. And of course, I have my own, private opinions about different types of fingerings, but I'm going to try to look at this pretty objectively based on what I've just said, right? So the first thing that, when you look at this theme, the first thing to think, and I think this is an important step not to skip, is that this is not a very technical passage, right? I mean, it's a relatively moderate tempo. It's not slow, but it's not fast, and more importantly, there are not a lot of notes to manage, right? So that's kind of I would say maybe an average tempo, right? Some people play it faster, some people play it slower, but there's not a lot to manage there. So therefore, you have more license, right, in terms of your shifting. You can open up the possibilities of adding shifts for expressive purposes, even when it sort of breaks the fundamental rule of avoiding shifting unless it's absolutely necessary as dictated by the playability, the position, etc. So the first thing you want to ask yourself when looking at the music is what are the notes that are most important, right, for expression? Well, definitely the first note, right? The first note would be, sorry, not first note, but the first downbeat. The first note is more of a pickup, so while it is important, it's not going to have as much juice as the F sharp, right? So already I think you can kind of rule out one fingering, right? Which would be this, to vibrate there on the fourth, unless you have an amazing fourth finger. It's just going to be harder to vibrate as beautifully, as warmly. Then of course you're left with, okay, what other fingers, right? So the first note probably should be on a 1 in that case. So then maybe you'll choose 3 because 3 is natural, or you could choose 2, right? 2 would probably have the richest vibrato, but it also comes with a downside, which is that once you play the 2, you've sort of locked yourself into an extended position. And an extended position brings all sorts of other issues because it makes it more difficult to connect your vibrato. It makes it a little more difficult to shift because if you're shifting to a non-extended position, then you have to fundamentally change the shape of the hand. That's a bit of a different discussion, but anyway, you can do it, but it carries other risks. So that kind of leaves us with 1-3, right, as being the most obvious thing. And it's, I think, no surprise that most cellists do that fingering. It's very logical. Now it becomes very interesting because you're left with the next most important note is this D, right? The D is a very expressive note as well. And if you were to do this natural fingering, you're left with the fourth finger for that D. And more importantly, you're left with no good option to play the A afterward, except an open A, which lacks vibrato and therefore a certain degree of expression, or to shift to the D string somehow, which would, one, introduce a shift where you might not want one, and two, create a change in timbre, which you might not want. So always important to follow your ear when balancing these different things. And that's kind of the main point that I want to make, is that when you're looking for these types of fingerings, it's always a balancing act. You have to decide what's more important to you. Is it the absence of the shift? Or is it the quality of the sound, the quality of the vibrato, the comfort of your own left hand? These are all things that you have to manage, but I often see that people aren't making these calculations. They're just kind of blindly following what fingering works for them without thinking about whether it's really the best fingering available to them. Maybe if they sacrificed something small, they would get something really big and really meaningful in return. Like, for example, a much nicer sound on a note that's really important. So to conclude this discussion of just the beginning of this phrase, you have the possibility, of course, then to shift, right? But then again, it's another compromise because you have a shift. Or you could do one of Yo-Yo Ma's fingerings, which I really love. He goes, well, so there's a little bit of a modification you have to make. He actually breaks the first rule and starts here 4, so he can do shift here to a 4, and then extend, vibrate. It's kind of a brilliant fingering. It's also possible here to do, but it's more natural to start here because you're preserving the relative shape of the hand with the 4. So again, that in my opinion is a really wonderful fingering. I've never done it in performance because, again, everyone has a slightly different hand shape, and for me that extension is harder than it is, I suppose, for him. But again, that's just another example of a really ingenious fingering that has a lot of qualities that one could really admire and only sacrifices a little. Perhaps the only thing that it really sacrifices is the vibrato on the second note, the F sharp. But again, if you're training yourself really well, then that fourth finger can become a medalist. Okay, I've already talked a lot. I do want to just mention one other thing about fast passages. Just 2 kind of small rules that I like to think about. So first is what I would call the rule of home base. And that's basically that on the cello there are 2 positions that are much more familiar to us than any others. And that would be the first position, because for most of us it's the first position that we learn. And then it would also be the harmonic thumb position, the D and A harmonic thumb position, because that's the first thumb position we learn, and also because our thumb is on the harmonics, it's easier to locate in general. I think you could also give kind of an honorable mention to the 4th position, just because it's very comfortable. You have your thumb here at the bottom base of the neck, so it's also a very familiar position. And I'll give you a kind of an extreme example of using this rule of home base. I was watching a very interesting video on YouTube of Stephen Isserlis, one of my favorite cellists of all time, playing the Elgar Cello Concerto. And in this infamous passage, after up here, he did the following fingering. This is all standard. And then he shifted to a 4. Right? He shifted to a 4. That's pretty, it's kind of an absurd fingering actually, because you could just do 1 and you eliminate a shift, right? You would eliminate a shift there. He added a shift by shifting to the 4. But on the other hand, his fingering has some logic because that shift is big. That's a very hard shift. And if you can find a way to make yourself feel comfortable in that shift, then that's worth a lot. It might even be worth more than having an extra shift. Additionally, this passage kind of falls, I would say maybe it's like around the 70, 75 zone, right, of the continuum if you're thinking 0 to 100. It's very lyrical, but also quite technical in the sense that if you were to miss a note or play a note egregiously out of tune, it would pretty much ruin the passage. I think that's so in other words, accuracy is an important part of the passage's essence. Despite the fact that it goes quickly, you do need quality in the shifting, but you also need assurance. You need security. And so I just wanted to point out that very interesting fingering. I personally don't do it, but when I saw it, I was like, that's really, really interesting. It's very interesting fingering. And then finally, before we get to the Q&A, one other thing, I'll give you one other interesting example for technical passages. Again, my teacher, Emmanuel Feldman, my former teacher, he called this the magic half step. And that basically refers to the fact that it's much easier often to shift in a half step than it is to shift in a whole step or any larger interval. So where you can, you should shift in half step increments, mainly because it allows you to just grab the note within the hand position, right? Because ultimately the thumb is in the same place whether we're doing an extension or not. And if you're able to grab a note in the same hand position, it creates less risk, right? So my favorite example is the Arpeggione Sonata, this passage. Right at the top, if you do 3-3, just a half step, you don't have to shift. You basically just have to scoot your hand, right? Same thing here. I'm shifting on the half step. Shifting on the half step. The small half step shifts just create less risk. So I like to search for those often in passage work. Okay, I think that concludes my my spiel. So I already saw that there's a question, so we're going to get to the questions. Okay. Question from my good friend Nathan Chan. Thanks for tuning in, Nathan. What is a commonly accepted fingering in a well-known concerto that is widely misunderstood / ineffective? Okay, I have a good example. You're really testing me on the spot, Nathan, because I would have to think about this. I think if I thought about it for like an hour, I could come up with maybe a list of 2 or 3. But one just came to me, thankfully. So one that I think I've seen very commonly in the Haydn D major concerto in the first movement. And by the way, just to speak more generally, for those of you who are learning the Haydn or will learn it or have learned it, for me, Haydn is one of those pieces that if you were to look at it on the whole, it definitely belongs more in the, technical side of things, right? Maybe second movement aside. But there's so much scale passage work and arpeggiated passage work, precision, positional thinking, the avoidance of shifts. Those for me would be like the number one things when I'm trying to finger the piece. And I think in general, if you start from that vantage point and you try to make it really clean, then you can always add more juice or whatever you want to call it into it after, more slides, more risky fingerings, more expressive fingerings. But when you start with the baseline of being able to execute it really cleanly, I think you can get to the heart of the music, which is this kind of pristine, very, very classy and very, just very, very clean and charming and also humorous music. So the passage that I'm thinking of in question, I'll give you first the fingering that most people do that I really don't think makes any sense. Is it that one? I think so, yeah. So in the exposition we have, which makes total sense, right? Because that doesn't actually involve any shifting. Some people do 1-3, but sorry. I just extend from 2 to 3 there because it's a very small extension. So most people, they take that logic and they go, when the recap happens, they go and I think for a lot of people that fingering doesn't work because this is a position. First of all, it's too big to really extend from 2 to 3, so you do have to. This is a position that is not very familiar. You're kind of what I would call in no man's land. You're basically playing a set of notes in a particular position of your hand that you've rarely ever seen before. And I find that no man's land fingerings are best avoided. Instead, what I would do is just simply, there are a couple options, but I would do, I would stay all in one position, so you don't have to shift, don't have to extend. You can also find a way to do this with the thumb. Which I think is a little bit more secure, but it's, again, a little harder to get to. So there are always compromises, but I think that's a good example of one where, even if you ultimately end up doing that, which I don't think I will ever do again in performance because I find it difficult to play really in tune, like the kind of intonation that Haydn D really needs. Even if you ended up doing that, if you weren't aware of the other fingering, then you should have been. That's all I'll say about that. Okay. Second question. 70. I said 75% of Shafran's fingerings wouldn't work for you. Would I elaborate on that? Sure, I'll elaborate on that a bit. Actually, this is another really important point I wanted to make. Everyone's hand is different. I think it's really important to keep in mind that fingerings that work for some people won't work for you because, let's say, your hand is smaller, one of your fingers is shorter, all sorts of possibilities that could cause you to just be simply unable to do a fingering as well. And I think Shafran was a person with very strong fingers, very long fingers, and big hand, and he was able to do a lot of stretches that some people, including myself, just aren't capable of. So, for example, a couple months ago, I posted a reel on Instagram where I tried to do one of his fingerings in the Dvorak Concerto, which was something like, I think he did, or something, and then he did this absurd, like without shifting, it was literally a stretch. For me, I can do it, kind of, but I would never, ever do it in a concert. First of all, because I don't see the value of avoiding that shift. I find that shift, very expressive. And if you wanted to avoid the shift, there's a better way, the yo-yo fingering, to shift here and then you go up to the D string, right? I think that's a better way to avoid the shift because you're still able to vibrate here. There's not really a way to expressively vibrate that. So I disagree with that fingering on more than one level, but it's also a fingering that I just wouldn't do because my hand is not suited to it. And similarly with his infamous fingering at the beginning of The Swan where he does... I don't understand that. I mean, for me, it's a swan. It's gliding on water. It's okay to shift. I think there's nothing wrong with having a really, really tasteful slide there. I think it's part of the lyricism. And additionally, I think that Saint-Saëns knew that there would be a shift there. I'll actually tell you a really interesting story. This past summer, I was playing the Brahms clarinet trio for the first time. And for those of you who know the piece, there's a very famous moment in the I think it's the second movement. It's quite hard because you kind of have to find this note out of nowhere, and then you have to find another hard note after it. It goes it's just kind of out of nowhere. It's a little bit tricky. And I remember, I was playing and I was like, okay, I found a really nice fingering. I'm gonna do it too. So once I find it, or it was something like that. And I was like, I'm going to avoid the shift. It's going to be fantastic. I'm going to get it in tune. And then the clarinetist I was playing with was like, what fingering is that? And I was like, well, I'm trying to avoid the shift. And he was like, do you really think Brahms didn't know that there would be a shift there? And I was like, oh, that's actually a really interesting point. I bet he probably knew that the cellist would have to... And that expressive quality was part of the point, part of the passage. So I do that hard fingering now. It is a hard fingering, but I think it's also more true to the music. Okay. Question. Quick question, unrelated to this topic. Where can one find sheet music for the arrangement of the Bach flute partita that I played? So there are two options. One is that, so this is, by the way, the A minor flute partita. I played it a couple times last year, and I have a part. I don't think it's available on the internet, and unfortunately, it's kind of a funny story. I use an iPad. I use Fourscore, and the title page was the first page of the document, and it said who arranged it. And I deleted the title page because I didn't want to have to keep pressing the pedal one time every time I opened the document. So I don't remember who arranged it. I would have to dig up the original file somewhere. But one option is that you can basically just take the flute music and then play it in D minor, starting here. So yeah, it shouldn't be too hard to do, actually, I think. Only a few modifications, but otherwise pretty much everything is in the same relative register. Okay. At any point in learning a piece, do you finalize your fingerings and won't change them going forward? Very interesting question. Thanks for the question, Josh. Thanks for tuning in, too. Yes. I think that at a certain point, I would say for me, it's about maybe a week before the concert. You have to kind of make at least like 99% decisions about the fingerings. And often what will happen, especially with pieces that you know well, that you've played many times, is that you'll kind of have like two or three fingerings under your belt that you've done, or let's say two fingerings under your belt that you've done a lot. One example I can give you is in the Tchaikovsky Rococo variations, which I've played, I guess, relative to other pieces a lot. In the sixth variation here, I've done both 3-3, and I've done 3-1-2. So those two fingerings, both for me, are like fingerings that are normal. Like, it's not hard for me to work up one of those fingerings. If I practiced it a few times, I'd be able to do it in a rehearsal or whatever, right? So having a couple of those moments where like you have just choices to make can be good. But of course, at a certain point, like let's say when you're rehearsing, like if you're playing a sonata with a pianist, probably by the first rehearsal before the concert, you want to pretty much know what you're doing. There are some cases where your fingerings just really, nothing has been working, and you make a last minute change kind of out of desperation. And that actually happened to me in the Elgar Concerto with this passage that I referenced at the very beginning. I was playing in the rehearsals and I was doing this fingering all with 1-2, 1-2. And I kept missing like at least one or two of these shifts. Like the two hard ones for me were, that's hard, and this is, the last one is really hard too, right? So then I was like, I went on YouTube and I looked at Yo-Yo, and like he always nails it. So I was like, what is he doing? He's doing like 1-2, 1-2, 3. So I tried it in the rehearsal. I was like, it doesn't work for me. As you see, I just messed it up. And then I like came up with some other even fancier fingering. And then like the day of the concert, I was like, nothing's working. I'm just going to go back to the old fingering. And then I messed it up in the concert. So, these things happen. But it's actually kind of funny to look back on it. But I'm happy to say that with passages like that, where you have like a gazillion different permutations, a bunch of different options, you really just kind of have to keep searching for one that works. And I'm pretty happy because I think I found one that has like like if let's say the other fingerings were like more like 70-80% success rates, this one is like 90 plus. So it's so I'd like to shift now on the harmonic. So the first hard shift is, there's a little bit of a safety net there with the harmonic. Yeah. So yeah, that's my answer to that. Okay. What's my opinion on Yo-Yo's infamous 1-2 extension? Another question from Nathan. Well, it's one of my favorite topics in the world to discuss. I don't know if all of you have seen this collab that we did at the very beginning of the pandemic with the Klangel Hymnus with 12 cellists. I was really lucky to be a part of that. And Yo-Yo was playing the first cello. And the first cello, has this very beautiful... has this very beautiful melody up here, but it's like really hard, and the way he was doing it was just unbelievable. All these, all these extensions, and like no shifting at all. It's just like all extended, and it was so pure and so in tune. And then of course I also remembered this famous moment in the Arpeggione Sonata where he goes here, no shift. No shift. It blows my mind. No shift. He extends from the B flat to the F. I just can't do it. My hand isn't big enough. So, I wish it were, but it isn't. So my opinion on it is that he is just, for those of you who don't already know my opinion on Yo-Yo, I think he's easily one of the greatest cellists of all time for so many different reasons. But he's an absolute genius when it comes to fingerings, because he's so aware of his own body, and his hand type is very different than what Rostropovich's was. And Rostropovich had these big mushroom pads, like very thick fingers, and so he was able to play with very high strings and approach the fingerboard very, very pianistically. Like every note was like a lot of like downward pressure, like vertical pressure. And with Yo-Yo, his fingers are very slender at the top, and you'll see that even today, the way he plays, it's a lot on the pad and very flat fingers often. So like, for example, another fingering that I love of his, speaking of 1-2 extensions, again, that famous moment in the Elgar, which I guess produces a lot of opinions. He does, I think, extension there, shift, extension, and then here he does 2 again instead of 3. He could have just done 3, but he likes that expressive half-step shift, which again is what I was saying with the magic half-step, that it's not a hard shift to execute usually. But anyway, that's just an amazing fingering, and the reason I think he can do it is because he's approaching so flat. The fingers are so flat. He's able to really get so much range with this extension, the 1-2. I've tried to emulate that, but my hand ultimately is different than his, so I can't do all of his fingerings, but I can do some. I can do that fingering, but again, it's not something I would probably do in performance, just because it doesn't click with my hand the way that I would want a really perfect fingering to. Yeah. Okay. Noam, thanks for tuning in. Or sorry, I skipped one. Ryan, thanks for tuning in. I'm currently working on the Saint-Saëns Concerto, and I'm wondering, with the double stop fifths and sixths, could you talk about barring fingers? Yeah, and the double stops and the best way to finger those without major discomfort. Yeah, absolutely. So my short answer to that is that you don't want to bar, especially as you get higher. I think that it's been a while since I played this, so I hope I get this right. But obviously at the beginning, you do have to bar. Basically, you have no option. And then I forget exactly what it is. Oh my goodness. I might need to just pull this up because it's been a long time since I think I have it in my force course. Just give me a sec. All right, I have it here. Yeah, okay, here we go. So, okay, this is all normal. Or sorry, I'm playing the wrong note. There we go. I was wondering why something sounded so wrong. Okay, so here, starting here, I would definitely not bar, because again, barring, there's just not enough space here. This is going to get in the way. So I would do a lot of this kind of fingering. You have to bar here, but then something. Again, I wouldn't bar here. I would do. So the whole thing is kind of not barring as little as possible. Doing more of this kind of thing where you bring. It's another very uncomfortable position, but for me, that's the only option that really works. Yeah, there are also a couple of ways you can integrate the thumb. But in general, I've seen a lot of people, like, they really struggle with all the barring. And then when I tell them, have you considered this fingering? And they're like, never even thought of it. So I think even if you go with the barring, you should be aware that there are other ways to execute it. I hope that answers your question. So yeah, experiment with doing this and this, so you can kind of so now you have the fifth on top and then fifth on the bottom, and then it's a little bit easier when you have so much sound going on to get it, because the intonation is not as apparent, but it's just a hard passage. What can one say? Yeah. Well, it's been a long time since I can't believe it. Be natural. Be natural. Okay. Question from Noam. Okay. Have you figured out how to use, apply consciously Richard Aaron's slidey fourth finger vibrato in a performance context? Okay, that's actually a very interesting question, because so the fourth, to put some context into that question, the fourth finger vibrato that my teacher Richard Aaron does is kind of, it's very very unstable generally, and while it can end up being a bit tasteless, the intent behind it is actually correct, I think, because ultimately the way that one vibrates the fourth finger is different than the other fingers. With the other fingers, you can easily vibrate with the thumb still attached to the neck, right? You can, it's fine. But when you get to the fourth finger, it's so weak that you can't really get enough range. You can't get enough range by keeping the fourth finger, by keeping the thumb attached to the neck. So I find that you generally, to get a little more range, you want to release the thumb. So I think that's the principle, that he's releasing the thumb, and then of course he doesn't have enough groundedness in the pressure, so it ends up being, but it's that principle that you want. Somehow to release the thumb so you have a little more range and width in the vibrato. What are your thoughts on fingering repeated passages? Joel, thanks for your question. Do you mind just sending another question again? Because could you just clarify what you mean by repeated passages? Do you mean passages that happen twice in a piece, like how to do them differently, or are you thinking of a particular? If you're thinking of a particular passage in a particular piece, that would be helpful. Thank you. Any thoughts on historical fingerings for 19th century music? Putting the thumb on one note and keeping it there, playing on the four strings, and Romberg and Boccherini were doing. Very interesting question, actually. So I think there are two different types of, I think what you're saying is, first of all, it's fascinating, but it kind of encompasses two different things. So one is what you describe accurately kind of as like the Boccherini type of fingering, where he wrote all these, sonatas and concertos where it's there's all this stuff like, and there's like all this stuff, I can't imitate it, but it's like all this passage work, and it's pretty clear that he intended it for it to be played all in one position, right? Like it would make no sense to just like do it all in the A string. Even though like often on a particular note, you might have like, and like you're on the thumb and it's like doesn't sound good because you can't vibrate that high up there on the thumb. But that's what he intended, right? So I think there are two approaches. One is that you just do that because that's, as you said, historical. That's kind of what was intended in the context of that particular piece of music. Or you cheat a little bit. You combine the elements that were pretty clear that are pretty clear to you as being necessary to execute the passage in the way that he intended. And then when you get to a place like that, you know, you just shift a little bit or you alter something small. Now, I think the second thing that what you're saying encompasses is sort of that mentality that cellists took from like Boccherini and all that stuff. And then they applied it to pieces that were written by people who weren't cellists. And then they just came up with abysmal fingerings that make no sense. So, you know, I think you can find this most commonly in like 19th century editions that are edited by cellists, especially cellists that let's say, not to demean them or anything, but cellists who today aren't very well known, you know, typically those will have like very, very, very bad fingerings. Yeah, as you said, like, you know, there might be like some ridiculously beautiful like melodic passage, and it's like all there, and just because for the sake of the thumb being there, and it just doesn't make any sense. So in that case, I think again, just you have to use your musical intelligence to understand where the composer was coming from. If the composer was a cellist and something fits really easily in a particular position, then it's likely that they were thinking of it being in that particular position. Yeah, but thanks for the question. Nice one. Okay, let's just try to finish this. Do you write fingerings in your part, or are they still all in memory? Do you have any principles for writing out fingerings? I definitely write my fingerings out in parts, because sometimes like when I find a really nice fingering, I'm really afraid that I'm going to forget. And in fact, that happened to me. I came up with like what I thought was like a really good fingering in the Elgar like a few months ago, and now I'm working on it again, and I forgot what it was. And I was like, I think it was this, but the problem is not knowing that for sure that it was that makes you see the fingering differently. Because once you know that a fingering is good and you write it in, then your later self will be like, you know, at some point I thought that fingering really worked. So let me see how I can try to make it work for me now. You know? So I write in pretty meticulously, especially when there are a lot of different options. When it's pretty obvious that there's only one fingering that works, I usually won't bother. But I like to write in a lot of fingerings. Do you have a specific approach for fingering the opening double stops in the first Shostakovich concerto? Let me pull it up. Let's see. That's a hard one. All this stuff, yeah. Yeah. But the hard one is this one, right? Again, I mean, I think that you should try on the last one, especially to use the same thing that we were talking about in the Saint-Saëns, where you use the fingers kind of together for the fifth. Otherwise, you know, what I do there, I think, is I do thumb, one thumb, something like that. I think that works in practice. Again, it's just a hard passage. You have to practice it a lot. But one thing I will add about passages like that, where it's like very tricky and gnarly, the most important thing to pay attention to, because there are very limited options with the fingering, you kind of have to make a suboptimal fingering work. And there are situations, aside from this also, where, you know, there's only like two fingerings that work and both of them kind of suck. You have to kind of choose the lesser of two evils. But more importantly, you have to find what is causing you to have difficulty with the fingering. So for example, what is it? Is it the positioning of the wrist? Is it the fact that my elbow's too low? Is it the fact that my finger angle is not right? Am I too vertical? Am I slipping? You know, all these questions you can ask yourself, and then find the root cause of your difficulty, and then work on that within the context of the fingering. So that's the only tip I can give. Does Richard Aaron still talk about the Manhattan shift? Yeah, I think so. This kind of shift where you like. I don't do it ever. I just can't do it. It doesn't make sense to me. I like to shift. I like to shift in a position, because for me, cello fingering is all about positions. And when you shift like that, just for those of you who don't know, Manhattan shift is basically you shift to anywhere random with the thumb, and then you extend the rest of the way. So like, for example, the shift in the block nigun, that big shift there, you would first shift here and then But for me, that just doesn't make any sense because I want to feel, again, I don't want to be in no man's land. This is no man's land to me, and this is also no man's land. I want to be in a position that I'm familiar with, that I've played a lot in before. This may be off topic, but do you have any advice on how to make the pinky stronger for vibrato? My pinky tends to collapse. Thank you for your time. Thanks for, it's my pleasure. Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, the pinky finger, I think, well, one thing, you know, they're the famous clangle exercises where you practice in the thumb position. But overall, I think, you know, just using it and practice a lot of scales in the low positions just to strengthen it. But in general, what I was saying about releasing the thumb might also help because it loosens your hand a little bit so you can add more backup, basically, like backup strength to the fourth finger when you're vibrating. I know it's very easy to collapse, but you want to get into a point where the finger is just very, very robust. So just use it a lot, basically. Okay, I think this, thank you so much for your questions. Now we're going to proceed to a couple of more general questions that are from the In the Practice Room series from Cello Bello. So I'm going to pull them up here on my phone. Thank you all so much for your questions. And so we're going to wrap this up here. So there are a lot of them, so I won't get through all of them, but I'll just touch on a couple of them that I think are most interesting. What is on my music stand right now? Actually, I have my iPad, but in terms of sheet music, I have this incredible new arrangement that a friend of mine did of the Borodin Petite Suite. Marshall Estrin, he arranged it. And I haven't performed it yet, but it's for cello and piano. You know, the original piece is just for piano solo. But I'm really looking forward to playing this whole thing at some point in concert. What is the first thing you do on the cello every day? Pretty consistently, tune, and then I'll play a D major scale, 4 octaves, usually 3 notes per bow. I find that it's good to just have like one thing that you do at the beginning of your practice because it makes it a little bit like a prayer. You know, it's like something that you can really rely on, no matter if you didn't practice well the previous day or if, you know, you're about to have a really bad practice session. You still have something that you can kind of latch onto and say, I did this at least. Let's see. What do you enjoy the most about practicing? What inspires you? So I would say that for me, the beauty of practicing is that it's a safe space. It's only you and your own opinions about your own playing. And what fascinates me most is the ability to search for one's own flaws. Basically, it's a practice in self-betterment. And I think it's the identification, evaluation, and correction of one's flaws as a cellist. I think it's something very spiritual. I think it's something very meaningful to do in your life as a human being. To always try to be better the next day. So that's why I practice. That's why I keep coming back, and that's why I find it really meaningful to play this instrument. Okay. How do you stimulate creativity and imagination in the practice room? It's a good question. Sometimes it's very easy to get just caught up in like just trying to sound better, and you kind of lose sight of what you're actually trying to do. When that happens, I just go on YouTube and I listen to Yo-Yo Ma. No joke. He's my favorite. So, what is your favorite way to change things, get new ideas? Listening to people on YouTube, looking at their fingerings, trying to copy them, seeing what it's all about. How do you go about deepening your musical imagination? I think one good place to start is when you're playing a piece, like let's say you're playing the Shostakovich Concerto, trying to familiarize yourself with the role that this piece plays in the composer's larger musical output. So, you know, maybe start with listening to the pieces that are around the same opus number, learning a little bit about what was going on in their life at the time, and start to see how it fits into their musical language. You know, one of the things that's interesting about being a cellist is that very few of the pieces that we play in our repertoire were the most important works written by that composer. Like, okay, we have like 5 Beethoven sonatas, but those are far from the most important works. You have the symphonies, the piano sonatas, the string quartets, Fidelio, they all come kind of ahead of the cello sonatas. Even the violin sonatas probably come ahead of the cello sonatas, right? They're pretty low on the totem pole of in terms of the genre, right? So understanding, kind of being humble in that respect, knowing that okay, I'm only interpreting a more minor work of a great composer. So how does this work fit into their larger scheme? What were they all about as composers? We're lucky. Some pieces, for example, I would say the Britten works for cello, written for Rostropovich. Those really are major works, I would say. Of course, again, you have for Britten, opera and vocal music was a more important genre than instrumental in general. But since he wrote 5 works for cello, that was a pretty important collaboration. I think those are very serious works. Similarly, the Elgar Cello Concerto is one of Elgar's most important works, I would say, and arguably his best orchestral work in some ways. But yeah, so yeah, the listening to the music written by the composer that you're working on. Practicality, technique. Sorry, we're just going to wrap up in a few minutes. Thanks for staying, everyone. In your mind, what is it that makes an effective practice session? I think that an effective practice session is a practice session where you sit down with a couple of goals to achieve and you achieve them. That's what effective, because often we sit down and we're like, I'm going to make it through the whole movement and I'm going to work through it and I'm going to spend 5 minutes on every passage and clean up these passages, and then you only make it a third of the way through, and then you go eat dinner and then you watch TV and there's a football game, and then I'm tired, I'm going to bed. That was not an effective practice session because you didn't get all your goals done. But that also happens. I would say probably at least 70% of my practice sessions are ineffective. But I'm working on trying to make that a higher percentage, a lower percentage rather, of ineffective practice sessions. How many hours a day should one practice? Quality or quantity? I think people go about this in the wrong way. I think that you shouldn't think about how many hours you should practice. You should think about how much repertoire do I need to work on and what do I need to get done in it, right? So if you're working on a full concerto and you need to perform it in a week, I think you're probably, if you really want to get into the details every day, you're probably looking at least several hours. If you're looking at a sonata, a full recital program, 2 concerti, and you're trying to go to details, 10 hours wouldn't be enough, right? So I think you need to go by what your expectations are for your practice, and then how much repertoire you have, and then combining those two, you kind of have a formula for how long you should practice. But another rule of thumb is that I think we've all gotten to that point where at a certain point when we're practicing, we're like, wow, it's starting to feel easier. Wow, I feel really good. I can really play the cello. You start to have some inkling of belief that you might actually be at least a little good, because usually when you start playing in the beginning of the day, you're like, oh, it's out of tune. I'm no good, but as you practice more, maybe 3-4 hours, you're like, oh, wow, my hand feels really supple. My bow feels really free. I'm starting to get physically integrated with the cello. If you get to that point, I think go a little further, and then you're probably done for the day. Let's see. What are the best ways to prevent injury? I would say frequent breaks, and using the time away from the instrument to do a lot of stuff that you might do with the instrument. So, for example, planning out what you're going to do instead of planning while playing. A lot of people, they'll play through first to try to evaluate, but maybe you can do that before without having to play through and just get right to the meat and potatoes of your work. What is your balance between technique and repertoire? I would say 30 to 45 minutes of technique a day, and then the rest repertoire. And I'm practicing on average 3 to 5 hours a day, I would say, depending on how much I have to balance. Let's see. Okay, let's just do a couple follow-up questions. How has your practicing evolved over the years, or even recently? I would say that I think my practicing now is a lot more, I'd say it's a lot more performance dependent. I always practice better when I have something to work toward. And, I think when I was younger and I had fewer performances, Sometimes I would just practice more for the sake of practicing, and I think that's harder. I think it's better if you have goals because that pushes you to really meet the standards of those challenges. Um, yeah. How do you start learning a new piece? Why don't we make this the last question? I always listen to several recordings, as many as possible. I think that I've always thought that when you listen to a recording, especially of a great player playing a piece, you're basically getting like a cheat sheet to the piece because they've put in hundreds of hours. They might have performed it hundreds of times and then sat down at the recording session and showed you their knowledge, right, of the piece through their performance. And you can just absorb that knowledge by listening to it. You can notice, they're doing this fingering, they're doing this bowing, they're taking time here, they're making this musical decision about this particular place. They feel that the climax is here, right? You can learn so much. They have this kind of overall tonal image for the piece, this kind of sound color here, right? You can learn so much, gives you so many ideas. Take all those ideas in, and then look at the music and try to make sense of it. But it's really just like a cheat sheet, I think, to listen to great players and to listen to a lot of them. We just have, I guess, one. Yeah, that was the last question. And just to say some closing remarks, just want to thank everyone for tuning in. It's been fun to spend this hour with you, and thank you to all who asked questions. On the whole, I would just sum up by saying that finding good fingerings should be really fun. It should be kind of like looking at the cello in a mathematical, geometric way, but also one that encourages you to be inspired and think about the music in a different way. Think about hierarchy, think about importance, think about expression, and think about also purpose, I think. Because this continuum that I talked about, ultimately, it's a very musical idea because it involves evaluating what the heart of the music you're playing really needs from you as the performer. So, and then most of all, just have fun. I think it's really fun to be able to play the same passage with 4 or 5 different fingerings. And it's also really fun to tell people why you don't like certain fingerings. So yeah, it's all kind of part of the critical game, just like passion about sports teams or movies or whatever. Become a little bit of a nerd and then take that passion with you when you perform and when you practice. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining, and hope to see you next time.